I thought the greatest humiliation of my life was receiving my doctorate with zero family in the audience. I was wrong. The nightmare was discovering they chose my brother's barbecue over my graduation, then secretly used my degree and intellect to build a fraudulent empire. When it exploded before investors, reporters, and my mother, everyone understood. The daughter they dismissed as a bookworm knew exactly which thread to pull to bring the entire curtain crashing down. My name is Harper Rodriguez. I am 31 years old, and I spent the last 7 years of my life bleeding over a keyboard, surviving on stale coffee, and dissecting corporate labor data to earn the heavy velvet tam currently resting on my head. I stood in the humid staging area of the Westbridge University arena, the thick fabric of my doctoral robe stifling in the late spring heat. The air buzzed with the nervous, electric energy of 200 graduates waiting to march. People were adjusting their hoods, laughing with their cohort members, and peering excitedly through the heavy black curtains to spot their loved ones in the sprawling stadium seating. I was looking through that same gap in the curtains, but I was not smiling. My eyes were locked on a very specific patch of the arena. Row 12. Seats A through D. 4 folding chairs. 4 painfully empty folding chairs right in the middle of a sea of cheering, waving families. My phone vibrated violently against my hip. I pulled it from the hidden pocket of my dress. The screen lit up with a message from my mother, Elena Whitaker. The text was brief. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact that dropped into my stomach like a cold, jagged stone. I cannot make it in time. Mason's barbecue is way busier than we expected. A famous food vlogger just showed up. Right below the text was a high-resolution image file. I tapped it open, my thumb hovering over the glass. There was my half-brother, Mason Whitaker, standing like a conquering king in the center of our family's sprawling backyard. He was leaning casually against the massive custom-built industrial smoker I had spent 40 hours helping them negotiate the financing for 2 years ago. He held a craft beer in one hand and a pair of stainless steel tongs in the other. His teeth were perfectly white against his tan skin. Surrounding him was a thick crowd of laughing guests, a professional camera crew setting up a shot, and my mother, beaming with the kind of unfiltered, radiant pride she reserved exclusively for her golden boy. I stared at the image until my vision blurred. The stifling heat of the staging area suddenly felt like ice against my skin. The sheer audacity of the text paralyzed me for a long moment. I had defended my dissertation. I had pushed myself to the brink of physical and mental exhaustion, and she was missing it for ribs and craft beer, driven by some masochistic need to hear it from her own mouth, to force her to actually say the words out loud. I hit the call button. The line rang 3 times. When she answered, the background noise of the backyard barbecue was deafening. "Harper, I really cannot talk right now." My mother shouted over the heavy bass of a country music track and the clinking of glass bottles. She sounded breathless, annoyed even, as if my calling on the exact hour of my doctoral hooding was a petty inconvenience she barely had time to swat away. "You are not coming," I said. My voice sounded hollow, completely stripped of all the fiery indignation I thought I would feel. It was just flat, dead. "I just sent you a text about this," she said, her tone clipped and rushing. "Mason has a huge opportunity right now. A massive local investor is here tasting the brisket. He might want to expand the brand. You understand how important this is." I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind her of the thousands of hours I spent researching, writing, and defending my work. I wanted to remind her that we had this specific date circled in bright red ink on the kitchen calendar for 8 full months. I wanted to ask her why Mason pouring beer for a vlogger was a triumph, while my doctorate was an afterthought. Before I could form a single syllable of those thoughts, a heavy, aggressive voice cut through the receiver. My stepfather, Wade Whitaker, had clearly grabbed the phone from her hand. "Harper, stop overreacting," Wade barked, his voice dripping with his usual condescension. "It is just a ceremony. They mail you the piece of paper either way." Why do you always have to make everything a dramatic crisis and expect everyone to drop what they are doing to run around for you? He did not wait for a reply. He did not care if I had one. The call disconnected with a sharp beep. I stood there, trapped in the corner of the staging area, staring at the screen showing the call ended duration as 22 seconds. 22 seconds. That was all the time my family could spare for the culmination of my entire academic career. "Line up! Candidates!" the floor coordinator yelled, clapping her hands aggressively to cut through the chatter. "We march in 2 minutes." I shoved the phone back into my pocket. I swallowed the thick, painful lump in my throat. I fixed my posture, squaring my shoulders beneath the heavy black robe. I joined the line. Walking onto the main floor of the arena was a sensory blur of bright spotlights and thunderous applause. Families were screaming from the bleachers, waving homemade cardboard signs, holding up massive cutouts of their children's faces, and blowing air horns. I kept my eyes fixed strictly straight ahead, refusing to look at row 12. I marched toward the wooden stage, step by steady step, while my phone began to vibrate in a relentless, rhythmic buzz against my leg. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I knew exactly what it was without looking. The extended family group chat was lighting up. They were sharing the live video feed of Mason's backyard triumph, while I was walking up the carpeted stairs to accept the highest academic degree one could achieve in my field. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were sending fire emojis to a video of my brother flipping meat. The physical weight of being completely irrelevant in my own family pressed down on my chest. Far heavier than the velvet hood the faculty members were about to drape over my shoulders. "Dr. Harper Rodriguez?" The announcer's voice boomed through the massive stadium speakers, echoing off the high ceiling. I walked across the brightly lit stage. There was loud, sustained applause from the faculty section. My dissertation advisor smiled broadly from the front row, nodding her head in deep respect. As I reached the center of the stage, the dean of the business school stepped forward to hand me the heavy leather-bound diploma cover. He did not just hand it to me, he held onto it for a second, leaning in close as he shook my hand. "Congratulations, Harper," he whispered, his eyes entirely sincere beneath his academic cap. "I meant what I said at your defense panel last month. Your dissertation on corporate culture and operational risk is going to fundamentally change how modern businesses manage their labor liabilities. It is brilliant, transformative work." I smiled politely and thanked him, but as I walked down the steps on the opposite side of the stage, the stark reality of his words settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. The dean of a highly prestigious university understood my value. He saw the sharp edge of my intellect, the rigorous discipline of my mind, and the practical, real-world power of my research. Yet, to the people who shared my blood, I was invisible. Or worse, I was just the tedious background noise to Mason's glorious main event. It was a terrifyingly clear moment of realization. Strangers could see my worth perfectly. My family actively refused to. I did not go to any celebratory dinners at upscale restaurants after the ceremony. I did not meet up with my doctoral cohort for champagne toasts at the local bar. I drove my 10-year-old sedan straight back to my small, sparsely furnished rental apartment. I took off my academic regalia, hung the robe in the closet with careful, robotic precision, and placed the velvet tam on the top shelf. I ordered a cheap delivery pizza, sat on my worn fabric sofa, and stared at the black screen of my television in the dark. The silence of the apartment was heavy and suffocating, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the deafening silence from my family. Not a single congratulatory text message, not a single phone call asking how the ceremony went or how I felt holding the diploma. The sun went down, casting long, dark, lonely shadows across my cheap laminate living room floor. At exactly 9:45 that night, the screen of my phone finally lit up where it lay on the coffee table. My heart gave a pathetic, involuntary flutter of hope. Maybe they remembered. Maybe the backyard party had finally wound down. The guests had left, and the guilt of abandoning me had finally set in. I leaned forward and picked up the device. It was a text from my mother. "Hey, Mason needs to submit this commercial franchise application by tomorrow morning to lock in the real estate block downtown. The investor loved the food, but wants to see the official operational paperwork before he cuts a check. Can you quickly look over this PDF and fix any legal mistakes I attached the file?" I read the words. And then I read them a second time, and then a third. There was no, "I am so proud of you." There was no, "How did it feel to walk across the stage today?" There was only a blind, entitled demand for my free labor. They did not see my doctorate as a monumental achievement of human intellect and endurance. They saw it as a brand new, highly efficient screwdriver they could use to fix Mason's messy, disorganized business ventures. I was not a daughter. I was an unpaid, live-in consultant they could summon whenever the golden boy messed up his paperwork. I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box. For years, I had compromised. For years, I had swallowed my pride, fixed their payroll discrepancies, corrected their labor compliance forms, wrote their vendor emails, and smoothed over Mason's careless operational mistakes, all in the desperate, quiet hope that one day they would look at me with even half the admiration they showered on him. I locked the phone screen and placed the device face down on the wooden table. I did not type a reply. The sharp, paper-cut pain of their betrayal was suddenly gone, evaporated into the quiet air of my apartment. It was rapidly replaced by something entirely different. It was a cold, quiet, and profoundly steady resolve. The desperate girl who wanted their approval died somewhere between row 12 and the graduation stage this afternoon. What was left sitting on the sofa was a woman who finally understood the exact rules of the game they were playing. They thought I was just the quiet, practical girl who cleaned up their messes in the background. They had absolutely no idea that I was the only person who actually understood how their entire machine worked. And more importantly, I was the only one who knew exactly which wires to cut to tear the whole thing down. I always carried the name Rodriguez like a piece of heavy, mismatched luggage inside my own home. My biological father died when I was barely old enough to form permanent memories, leaving me with nothing but a few faded photographs and his last name. When my mother, Elena, married Wade Whitaker a few years later, our entire existence underwent a sudden, sweeping rebrand. The mailbox planted in the front yard said Whitaker. The embroidered guest towels hanging in the bathroom said Whitaker. The annual holiday cards sent to relatives and neighbors proudly announced greetings from the Whitaker family. I was the leftover piece from a canceled television show, walking quietly through hallways where absolutely everything belonged to someone else. I learned very early how to shrink myself to fit perfectly into the background of their spaces. Then came Mason. Mason Whitaker was the undisputed face of the family franchise long before a legitimate business even existed. From the time he was 10 years old, he possessed a natural, effortless charisma that seemed to bend the gravity in any room he entered. He grew up conventionally handsome, incredibly quick with a joke, and armed with the kind of loud, booming laugh that made people want to instantly agree with whatever he said. My mother looked at him and saw nothing short of a star. She relentlessly praised him to anyone who would listen, framing him as a natural-born culinary prodigy who could tame fire and smoke just by standing near a grill. To her, he was the brilliant artist, the very soul of the backyard. But charm does not balance a corporate ledger. A booming laugh does not secure a commercial food handling permit from a strict county health inspector. While Mason was out front charming the weekend crowds, shaking hands, and handing out free plates of burnt ends to local neighborhood influencers, I was the one suffocating in the cramped, windowless back office. The air back there always smelled permanently like stale grease and cheap printer ink. I was the one who quietly rebooted and reprogrammed the point-of-sale system when it crashed on a chaotic Saturday night. I manually calculated the weekly payroll for 12 part-time employees because Mason consistently forgot to submit the digital timesheets on time. When Mason blindly signed a commercial lease for a used retrofitted food truck with a completely blown transmission and thousands of dollars in hidden debt. He just shrugged his shoulders and said it was a learning experience. I was the one who spent 3 agonizing weeks drafting precise legal emails, citing specific consumer protection codes, to break that predatory contract without bankrupting the entire family. The psychological dynamic of our household was established early and solidified over a decade of relentless repetition. Whenever Mason stood in front of a crowd and spoke loudly, he was heavily rewarded with praise for having undeniable leadership qualities. When I stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning sorting through a greasy shoebox full of crumpled receipts to save us from a crippling tax audit, I was just being practical. I was simply the girl who knew how to do things. My intense labor was never viewed as an achievement or a sacrifice. It was merely expected. It was the baseline utility of my existence in their world. I was the invisible, structural scaffolding holding up the glittering, neon marquee of Mason's heavily curated life. This glaring disparity only grew sharper and more painful during my graduate studies. For 5 grueling years, I lived a brutal, punishing double life. During the day, I stood in brightly lit university lecture halls, working as a teaching assistant, grading hundreds of complex undergraduate papers, and desperately trying to scrape together enough mental clarity to write my own doctoral research. Then, the sun would set, and my second, entirely unpaid shift would begin. I would drive directly to the barbecue restaurant, my clothes smelling of dry erase markers and library dust, to audit the family books for absolutely free. I spent countless nights cross-referencing their hourly wage calculations to ensure they complied with strict state labor laws, desperately trying to protect them from devastating operational fines they did not even know existed. Through the thin, cheap drywall of the back office, I could often hear my mother holding court in the main dining room. She loved to proudly show off Mason to the regular customers, pointing toward him behind the carving station like he was a famous sculptor displaying his masterpiece. He would wave, flash that perfect smile, and the customers would clap. But if a patron happened to notice me walking out of the back room and asked who I was, my mother's tone would instantly flatten into a dismissive, rushed summary. "Oh, Harper? She studies a lot. She just stays in the back. She handles the paperwork stuff." That was the entire scope of my identity to the woman who gave birth to me. I was not a scholar. I was not a driven professional. I was a human calculator stored in the supply closet, brought out only when the numbers did not add up. The supreme, bitter irony of all this was the actual subject matter of my academic work. My doctoral dissertation was not some abstract, philosophical musing disconnected from reality. It was a razor-sharp, data-driven analysis of organizational culture and operational risk management. I wrote over 300 pages specifically detailing how small businesses and family-run enterprises systematically self-destruct because they rely on toxic personality cults rather than established safety protocols. I documented exactly how ignoring compliance, faking safety records, and bypassing legal processes inevitably leads to catastrophic corporate failure. I was writing the exact blueprint of my family's fundamental flaws. I made the naive mistake of trying to explain my thesis topic during a rare family dinner one Sunday evening. I thought, for a fleeting moment, they might see the value in what I was dedicating my entire adult life to. Wade just scoffed loudly, waving his metal fork at me from across the wooden table. "That is just a bunch of textbook theory." "Harper," Wade said, his mouth half full of smoked brisket. "The real world out there does not run on academic spreadsheets and rigid rules. It runs on relationships, gut instincts, and hustle. Mason has hustle. You just have a lot of really expensive, complicated theories that slow things down." Mason had smirked at that, taking a slow sip of his cold beer, fully agreeing that my years of intense academic rigor were nothing more than a cute, impractical hobby compared to his real-world genius. My dissertation advisor, Dr. Eris Thorne, saw the reality of my situation much more clearly than I was willing to admit at the time. During one of our final review sessions, she sat across from me in her campus office, carefully looking over the meticulous labor compliance models I had built using my family's restaurant as a blind, anonymous case study. She took off her reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and looked at me with a deep, unsettling sense of pity. "Harper," Dr. Thorne said quietly, her voice laced with genuine concern, "you are giving them high-level, professional consulting for absolutely free. You are building their entire operational safety net, but you need to be very careful. People who refuse to respect your boundaries will eventually refuse to respect your professional identity. One day, they are not going to just ask for your free advice anymore. They are going to want to borrow your reputation to cover their corners when they cut too deeply." Sitting in that quiet academic office, looking at my brilliant advisor, I just smiled a soft, dismissive smile. I thought she was being overly dramatic, heavily influenced by the massive corporate fraud cases we studied in our advanced seminars. I genuinely did not believe my own family was capable of anything truly malicious or legally dangerous. I thought the absolute worst thing they could do was continue to ignore my boundaries, take my weekends for granted, and fail to say thank you. I thought the deepest wounds they could inflict were the small, daily cuts of being ignored and undervalued. I had absolutely no idea how far they were willing to go, or how terrifyingly prophetic Dr. Thorne's warning would turn out to be. I was a structural expert who somehow failed to notice that my own house was built on a massive sinkhole of lies. The morning after my graduation, I did not wake up and draft a long, emotionally bleeding text message to my mother. In the past, I would have spent hours agonizing over the exact phrasing, desperately trying to articulate my hurt, begging for an apology or at least an acknowledgement of my pain. I would have outlined exactly why missing my ceremony was devastating. But that morning, I simply woke up, brewed a pot of cheap coffee, and sat down at the small laminate dining table in my rented apartment. The urge to explain myself to them was completely gone. I was done bleeding for people who only saw me as a convenience. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed against the dim morning light. I clicked into the shared cloud drive I had maintained for the family business over the last 6 years. I sat there and methodically scrolled through the sheer volume of my unpaid labor. There were hundreds of meticulously formatted files, standard operating procedures for food handling, employee onboarding manuals, local health department compliance checklists, tax routing spreadsheets, complex vendor agreements I had drafted to keep Wade from getting sued by meat suppliers. Thousands of hours of my life, freely given, neatly organized in digital folders. I looked at it all not with pride, but with the cold, detached gaze of a forensic auditor assessing a crime scene. My phone buzzed on the table. It was not my family. It was a text message from Sarah, a friend from my doctoral cohort. She had attached a single screenshot with a brief message. "Hey, I was trying to find your family restaurant to order some food for my graduation party next weekend, and I saw this on their new catering site. Did you sign on as a consultant?" I opened the image. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a brand new, highly polished website for the Whitaker barbecue brand. It was sleek, modern, and heavily optimized for corporate catering contracts. I scanned past the photos of Mason looking rugged and authentic next to the smoker. Then, my eyes locked onto the About Us section. There, printed in a crisp, professional font, was a paragraph detailing their commitment to operational excellence and food safety. The final sentence hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "Our internal compliance and safety operations are strategically directed by Dr. Harper Rodriguez." A sudden, freezing wave washed over my entire body. I stared at the words until they began to blur. They had not just stolen my time. They were actively stealing my name. They had taken the degree they refused to celebrate just 24 hours ago and immediately weaponized it for their own profit. I had never been asked. I had never been consulted. I had certainly never signed any document authorizing them to use my academic title or professional identity in any promotional capacity. Dr. Thorne's warning echoed in the quiet room with terrifying clarity. They did not just want my free advice anymore. They wanted the protective shield of my credentials. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone. The burning anger I expected to feel was instantly replaced by a sharp, icy, and hyper-focused calm. The emotional daughter in me died, and the risk management specialist fully took the wheel. I immediately went to work. My fingers flew across the keyboard with ruthless precision. I opened the administrative settings for the family business cloud drive. I was the one who set it up, which meant I held the master administrative keys, one by one. I began changing the passwords. I revoked all shared access permissions. I locked down the employee training files, the compliance manuals, and the operational spreadsheets. I severed their connection to every single digital asset I had ever created for them. In less than 45 minutes, the structural foundation I had built for their business was completely sealed off behind cryptographic walls they would never be able to breach. Next, I opened a screen recording application. I navigated to their new website and slowly, methodically captured every single page, focusing heavily on the section that falsely claimed I was their strategic director. I took static screenshots. I archived every old email where I had explicitly warned Wade and Mason about proper corporate governance. I was no longer a family member organizing a business. I was a plaintiff building an airtight discovery file. When the digital lockdown was complete, I opened a blank email draft. I added my mother, Wade, and Mason to the recipient list. I did not start with a greeting. I did not ask how the backyard party went. I wrote exactly 3 sentences, devoid of any emotion, stripped down to bare, undeniable legal instruction, effective immediately. You do not have my permission to use my name, my academic degree, my signature, my academic materials, or any of my previous operational work in any capacity whatsoever. Remove my name and title from your website and all promotional materials by the end of this business day. Any further unauthorized use of my identity will be treated as fraud. I clicked send. The digital swoosh of the outgoing message felt like the heavy, iron door of a vault swinging shut and locking into place. I did not wait around for the fallout. That exact same week, I had a final virtual interview with a highly respected organizational risk consulting firm based out of Chicago called Civic Meridian Risk Group. They had read an early, pre-published draft of my dissertation on corporate self-destruction and reached out to me months ago. They did not care about barbecue or backyard charm. They cared about my ability to look at a chaotic corporate structure and instantly identify the exact fractures that would lead to lawsuits. When their human resources director called me 2 days later to formally offer me a senior analyst position, complete with a 6-figure salary and full relocation benefits, I accepted on the spot. I was in my bedroom, pulling my heavy winter coats out of the closet to pack into a large canvas suitcase, when my phone chimed with an incoming email. It was from Elena. I opened it, expecting panic or anger. Instead, I found the exact, predictable gaslighting that had defined my entire life in that house. Harper, you are completely overcomplicating a very normal situation, my mother wrote. We just put your name on the site because we are proud of you and we wanted the local clients to know we have smart people in the family. Why are you locking the files? You are making a huge, dramatic deal out of nothing. People in a family support each other. Call me when you calm down and stop acting like a stranger. There was a time, perhaps even 1 month ago, when those words would have triggered a deep, anxious guilt within me. I would have questioned my own sanity. I would have wondered if I was, in fact, being too rigid, too sensitive, too dramatic. But as I stood there holding my phone, looking at the half-empty closet of my small apartment, I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no desire to explain, no need to defend my boundaries against people who built their entire lives pretending those boundaries did not exist. I finally understood that arguing with them was completely pointless because we were not speaking the same language. They spoke the language of entitlement. I was now fluent in the language of consequences. I did not type a reply. I did not call her back to argue. Instead, I moved my cursor to the top of my email client. I created a brand new, highly secure folder. I named it Evidence. I dragged her email into the folder, right next to the archived screenshots of their fraudulent website and the timestamps of my revoked file permissions. I closed the laptop and placed it gently into my leather work bag. I went back to the closet and continued taking my clothes off the hangers, folding them neatly, and placing them into the suitcase. I was moving to a city where the wind cut like a knife, where the buildings scraped the sky, and where absolutely nobody knew the name Whitaker. For the very first time in my entire existence, I was choosing total silence. I was not staying quiet because I was weak, submissive, or afraid of their reaction. I was staying quiet because the game had fundamentally changed, and I had just made my first move on a very long, very unforgiving board. Chicago welcomed me with freezing morning winds coming off the lake, towering structures of steel and glass, and an environment where absolutely nobody cared who my brother was. I traded the perpetual, suffocating smell of hickory smoke and spilled cheap beer for the sharp scent of ozone, roasted espresso, and highly polished corporate lobbies. But the most intoxicating part of the city was not the incredible architecture or the relentless, driving energy. It was the absolute, beautiful anonymity. I walked into the sprawling downtown headquarters of Civic Meridian Risk Group on my very first day, and nobody looked at me and saw the quiet, useful, invisible sister. I was just Harper Rodriguez, a newly minted doctor of organizational risk, hired specifically because my mind operated like a steel trap. At Civic Meridian, I did not just fit in. I rapidly became a formidable presence. The firm specialized in massive corporate evaluations, and my daily scope of work involved assessing the catastrophic risks for national franchise contracts, rapidly expanding restaurant chains, high-stakes stadium concession agreements, and major public service projects. I possessed a deeply ingrained, almost predatory instinct for spotting the microscopic fractures in a company's culture that everyone else glossed over. I looked at glossy organizational charts and instantly saw the missing accountability links. I read sanitized safety compliance reports and could immediately tell when a shift manager was systematically faking the daily temperature logs on a commercial freezer unit just to pass a routine morning inspection. If a rapidly expanding burger franchise was manipulating their middle management overtime hours to make their quarterly profit margins look attractive to aggressive investors, I found the mathematical discrepancy hidden in their ledgers. If a regional supply chain was held together by verbal handshake agreements rather than legally binding vendor contracts, I flagged the liability before the ink ever touched the final paperwork. For the very first time in my 31 years of life, I was being heavily compensated for the exact same traits my family had relentlessly mocked: my obsessive attention to detail, my flawless systemic memory, and my dark, unyielding intuition for operational models that were quietly speeding toward a total disaster were no longer considered annoying personality flaws. They were highly billable corporate assets. I was earning well over $150,000 a year, complete with full executive benefits, simply for being exactly who I was. While I was building a sterling professional reputation in the high-rise towers of the Midwest, my brother was busy constructing a glittering, completely hollow monument to himself back home. He had aggressively rebranded the family operation. It was no longer just a casual neighborhood barbecue joint. It was now incorporated under the heavily stylized name Crown Ember Hospitality. Even the name dripped with a manufactured, premium arrogance that made my stomach turn. I did not actively seek out updates on their lives, but their aggressive digital footprint was impossible to escape completely. The social media algorithms constantly pushed my mother's public posts onto my feed. Elena had essentially become Mason's full-time, unpaid public relations manager. Her timeline was a relentless, exhausting barrage of Masons smiling at local charity galas, Masons speaking confidently into professional studio microphones on regional business podcasts, and Masons shaking hands with wealthy, middle-aged angel investors. He was aggressively pitching himself as the rugged, blue-collar chef who organically evolved into a next-generation hospitality king. He was selling a deeply curated story of raw authenticity, which was the most hilarious, infuriating lie of all. He claimed he built his empire from a single rusty smoker in a dirt backyard, conveniently omitting the thousands of unpaid hours I had provided to keep the local county health department from shutting that exact backyard down. Somewhere, buried incredibly deep beneath dozens of posts about Mason's soaring trajectory, was a single, blurry photo of my graduation program that Elena had posted months ago. It had exactly 4 likes. It was a quiet, rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. The office was humming with the low sound of fingers striking mechanical keyboards and the muffled drone of executive conference calls. I was deep into a complex risk analysis matrix for a regional coffee chain when my internal desktop messaging system chimed. It was Marcus, a senior associate who sat 3 desks down from my cubicle. He was currently leading the due diligence team for a massive municipal contract involving the city's brand-new baseball stadium. The city was aggressively vetting luxury food vendors for the stadium's premium club levels, a contract worth tens of millions of dollars. Marcus walked over to my desk, holding a thick, freshly printed physical dossier. He dropped it onto my desk with a heavy, authoritative thud. He leaned against the frosted glass partition of my workspace, holding a warm cup of coffee, and smiled a casual, genuinely confused smile. "Hey, Harper," Marcus said, tapping the thick, glossy cover of the dossier with his index finger. "I was just doing a preliminary read on this new competitive bid for the stadium's South Concourse concession rights. I know you specialize in operational safety culture and corporate architecture. Can you read the executive summary on page 12? I swear to God, the wording in their localized safety architecture section sounds exactly like your specific writing style. Did you consult for these guys before you moved up here to Chicago?" I frowned, genuinely confused by his question. I had never consulted for any commercial bids outside of my own academic research. I reached out and pulled the heavy binder toward me. I flipped past the glossy title page and the table of contents. My eyes scanned the top of the introductory document. The submitting entity was proudly listed as Crown Ember Hospitality. My breath caught sharply in my throat, choking off the air in my lungs. The temperature in my office seemed to plummet instantly. I turned the thick, premium paper pages with trembling fingers until I reached page 12. The bold heading read, "Structural Integrity and Decentralized Workforce Safety Protocols." I began to read the first few lines, and my heart did not just drop. It completely plummeted into the floor. The words printed on the page were not just remarkably similar to my writing style. They were my exact words. It was the core thesis argument from Chapter 4 of my doctoral dissertation. They had completely lifted entire, complex paragraphs about synergistic risk mitigation and behavioral safety compliance, almost verbatim, and seamlessly woven them into their commercial bid to secure a massive public contract. Mason did not even know how to spell synergistic, let alone implement it into a high-volume stadium workforce. The small localized family betrayal had officially crossed state lines, and it was now sitting directly on my desk as a physical piece of documented corporate fraud. I thanked Marcus, keeping my voice perfectly level, and told him I would take a closer look at the methodology section as soon as he walked away. I closed the physical binder. I needed the raw data. I logged into the secure Civic Meridian internal server and submitted a formal request to access the complete digital submission for the stadium concession bid. Within 10 minutes, a massive encrypted file landed in my inbox. It was over 600 pages long. I locked my office door. I closed the blinds. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee and began to read. I did not read like a sister feeling hurt. I read like a forensic auditor hunting for a pulse in a dead ledger. The deeper I scrolled into the appendices, the colder my blood became. On page 142, I found a comprehensive operational safety certificate. It was a legally binding document guaranteeing that Crown Ember Hospitality met all federal and state workplace hazard standards. At the bottom of the page was a digital signature. It was my name, Harper Rodriguez. Next to it was a date stamp from 3 weeks ago, a time when I was sitting in this exact Chicago office. I stared at the graceful, looping digital font. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never authorized this software platform to generate my signature. It was an outright forgery. I kept scrolling, my hand gripping the computer mouse so tightly my knuckles turned white. Section 4 of the bid outlined the corporate leadership structure. There was a professional headshot of Mason, looking visionary, and right below him was a blank silhouette placeholder with my name. The title beneath it read, Chief Culture and Safety Architect. The paragraph detailing my fictional role was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. It claimed I held a 20% consulting equity stake in the hospitality group. It stated unequivocally that I personally designed, implemented, and monitored the entire human resources training model for their workforce. But the most cynical, stomach-turning discovery was buried in the diversity and inclusion scoring matrix on page 210. Municipal contracts in major metropolitan areas award heavily weighted points to vendor bids that demonstrate minority and female leadership. Mason and Wade were entirely aware of this. They had shamelessly weaponized my gender and my late father's surname to check the right boxes. They were using a highly qualified Latina risk management expert as a phantom shield to make a company run by 2 white men look progressively diverse to a strict city council board. They were exploiting the very identity they always made me feel so isolated for possessing. The plagiarism extended far beyond the stolen paragraphs from my doctoral dissertation. In the Hazard Mitigation Annex, I recognized sentences I had written 5 years ago. It was a private, highly confidential email memo I had drafted for my mother when Mason nearly got the family sued for mishandling an employee grievance. I had written those exact words at 2 o'clock in the morning from my cramped university dorm room, desperately trying to protect them from a devastating lawsuit. Now, those exact sentences were neatly formatted into a glossy brochure to secure a multi-million-dollar public contract. I switched my focus from the narrative sections to the hard financial disclosures. Once I started looking at the numbers, the amateurish nature of their fraud became glaringly obvious to a trained eye. I pulled up their workers' compensation insurance certificates. The font kerning on the dates was misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter. Someone had clearly used a cheap software editing tool to backdate their coverage to make it look like they had been fully insured for 36 months instead of the actual 14. Then I examined the projected payroll ledgers. Mason was aggressively promising the city that he could staff 4 massive concession hubs with union labor while maintaining profit margins that defied basic economics. The math was impossible. To achieve the numbers printed on page 300, he would have to systemically underreport overtime hours by at least 30%. It was a beautifully formatted roadmap to a massive wage theft lawsuit. A few months earlier, I would have picked up the phone and demanded an explanation. This time, I did not. That version of me was gone. I took a deep breath. I hit the print command on my keyboard. I waited while the heavy office printer spat out 30 pages of forged signatures, stolen intellectual property, and manipulated financial models. I neatly stacked the pages, slid them into a manila envelope, and walked straight down the hallway to the corner office of my managing director, David Vance. David was a terrifyingly sharp man who had spent 20 years navigating the brutal world of corporate compliance. I knocked once and stepped inside. David, I need to formally declare a severe conflict of interest on the stadium concession bid, I said, my voice steady, projecting absolute professional authority. He looked up from his dual monitors, his brow furrowed in sudden concern. Take a seat. Harper, walk me through it. I placed the manila envelope on his glass desk. The primary applicant, Crown Ember Hospitality, is owned by my half-brother and my stepfather. Until this afternoon, I was unaware they were submitting a bid for this project. Furthermore, upon reviewing their submission package, I discovered they have fraudulently listed me as an executive stakeholder, forged my digital signature on safety compliance certificates, and plagiarized significant portions of my doctoral research to pass the municipal vetting process. I must completely recuse myself from any evaluation, discussion, or policy recommendation regarding this specific file. David did not blink. He opened the envelope and spent 5 silent minutes reviewing the highlighted documents. The silence in the room was heavier than concrete. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold and calculating. "You did exactly the right thing bringing this to me immediately," David said, his tone deadly serious. "I am going to pull our internal legal counsel into this right now. Do not speak to anyone else in the firm about this file." Within an hour, I was sitting in a soundproof glass conference room with David and the head of Civic Meridian's legal department, a ruthless former prosecutor named Sarah Jenkins. She spread the documents across the large mahogany table. "Harper, I need to be entirely clear with you," Sarah said, tapping a red pen against the forged signature page. "This has escalated light years beyond a simple family dispute over borrowing a name. Submitting this package to a municipal authority crosses a massive legal threshold. We are looking at wire fraud, egregious document forgery, and coordinated bid rigging. If the city auditor catches this, the individuals responsible are not just going to lose the contract, they are going to face federal indictment." I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic leather chair. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a strange, clinical intensity. I nodded slowly, confirming I understood the gravity of her words. "Civic Meridian has a fiduciary duty to the city," Sarah continued, her voice softening just a fraction, acknowledging the personal nightmare I was sitting in. "We cannot evaluate a bid we know contains fraudulent materials. We are going to have to flag this submission and quietly fail it in the preliminary risk assessment. But you need to protect yourself personally. Harper, you need your own outside counsel. You need to create an impenetrable paper trail proving you had zero knowledge of this operation." "I understand," I replied softly. I walked back to my desk as the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the office floor. I sat down and stared out the window at the endless grid of city lights. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of what my family had done finally settled over me like a suffocating weight. It was the most bitter, toxic truth I had ever been forced to swallow. My mother and my brother could not be bothered to drive across town and sit in a folding chair for 2 hours to watch me receive the highest academic honor of my life. They dismissed my intellect. They laughed at my dedication. They treated my achievements like tedious background noise. Yet, the absolute second my degree became a valuable token, they did not hesitate to steal it. They did not hesitate to forge my name and risk my entire professional future, my freedom, and my reputation just to secure a lucrative catering contract and a pile of municipal money. They had finally proven, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, exactly what I was worth to them. I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was an asset they thought they could exploit without consequence. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about risk management. I hired an independent litigator on a Tuesday morning. Her name was Miriam Vance, a sharp, unyielding attorney who specialized in corporate identity theft and contract fraud. Sitting in her austere, glass-walled office, I handed over the thick stack of physical evidence I had printed from the Civic Meridian servers. Miriam reviewed the forged safety certificates, the plagiarized operational framework, and the falsified diversity matrix with a terrifyingly calm expression. We did not draft a polite request. We drafted a heavily fortified, legally binding cease and desist demand. The terms were absolutely non-negotiable. Crown Ember Hospitality had exactly 72 hours to formally withdraw their municipal concession bid, scrub my name from every single piece of their public and private corporate architecture, and proactively self-report the structural discrepancies to the city auditor. If they complied, I would quietly step away. If they refused, Miriam would formally file a massive civil lawsuit and hand the forged documents directly over to the state prosecutor. It was the only lifeline I was willing to throw them. Less than 4 hours after the courier delivered the certified legal packet to the barbecue restaurant, my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 4 times before I finally pressed the green accept button and lifted the device to my ear. "Harper, please," Elena sobbed loudly into the receiver. There was no greeting. There was no hesitation. The sound of her weeping was a familiar, weaponized frequency I had endured for 3 decades. But listening closely, I realized she was not crying out of regret. She was crying out of sheer, panicked inconvenience. She did not utter a single syllable of apology for skipping my graduation. She did not express a fraction of an ounce of remorse for stealing my academic credentials. She was entirely focused on saving the Golden Boy's empire. "You have to call these lawyers off right now," Elena pleaded, her voice thick with manufactured hysteria. "You are going to ruin everything Mason has built. The stadium investors are finalizing the background checks this week. All you have to do is sign a simple, retroactive consulting agreement. We can backdate it 6 months. It is just a piece of paper. Harper, just sign it and make this nightmare go away so we can get this contract." I sat perfectly still at my kitchen island, staring at the blank, white wall of my apartment. The sheer suffocating audacity of her request temporarily paralyzed my vocal cords. She was openly asking me to commit a felony to cover up their initial felony. Before I could formulate a clinical response, the audio shifted. There was a loud rustling sound, and the sharp, arrogant voice of my half-brother cut through the line. He had snatched the phone right out of our mother's hand. "Listen to me, Harper," Mason sneered, completely devoid of the charming, folksy persona he projected to his adoring local podcast audience. "You are completely overreacting, as usual. Everyone in the corporate hospitality game dresses up their commercial resumes a little bit. We just polish the presentation. It is standard industry practice. Honestly, you are just throwing a massive tantrum because you are jealous. You have a fancy piece of paper from a university, but you have absolutely zero real-world charisma. You know you could never build a brand like I did, so you are trying to burn mine down on a pathetic technicality." His words were designed to trigger the old, deeply insecure version of myself. He wanted the sister who used to shrink into the background and quietly fix his messes to avoid a screaming match. But that sister no longer existed. "Then," Wade shouted from somewhere in the background of their office, his heavy voice dripping with self-righteous anger, "tell her that everything we do is for the family. We are trying to build generational wealth here. She needs to stop being so utterly selfish. Everything is for the family." It was the oldest, most decayed pillar of their entire manipulative architecture. It was the exact phrase they used to justify taking my weekends, my expertise, and my energy for absolutely free. And now, they were trying to use it to justify severe corporate fraud. I took a slow, measured breath. My voice, when I finally spoke, was not angry, it was not shaking, it was a cold, sterile blade. "I am giving you exactly 72 hours to comply with the legal demands outlined in the letter," I stated, articulating every single consonant with surgical precision. "I am not negotiating a backdated contract. I am not participating in a cover-up. If you fail to withdraw the bid and self-report by Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I will no longer communicate with you as a daughter or a sister. I will only communicate with you as an aggrieved party whose legal rights and professional identity have been maliciously violated. You have my terms. Do not call this number again." I disconnected the call and immediately blocked my mother's number. I blocked Mason. I blocked Wade. I severed the digital arteries of our relationship with 4 simple taps on a glass screen. They chose to call my bluff. They genuinely believed I was entirely incapable of following through with a threat against my own blood. 2 days later, Crown Ember Hospitality initiated a highly aggressive, passive-aggressive digital campaign. Instead of hiring legal counsel to fix their fraudulent municipal bid, Mason took to his heavily followed social media platforms. He posted a black and white photograph of himself standing in front of his massive industrial smoker, looking weary but resolute. The caption beneath the photograph was a masterclass in narcissistic victimhood. Sometimes, the hardest obstacles you face on the road to success come from inside your own circle, Mason wrote. There are always going to be book-smart theorists out there who completely fail to understand how the real world actually operates. Building a grassroots empire requires hustle, grit, and loyalty. It breaks my heart when relatives betray you the exact moment the business finally starts taking off. But we keep the fires burning. We keep feeding the community. We stay loyal. The post accumulated thousands of likes within hours. Local food bloggers flooded the comment section with messages of blind support and toxic positivity. I sat at my desk at Civic Meridian, drinking a cup of green tea, and read the entire post without feeling a single spike of adrenaline. He was digging his own grave in public, completely unaware that his shovel was made of digital arrogance. On Thursday morning, exactly 24 hours before my legal deadline expired, my personal email inbox pinged with an encrypted message from an anonymous sender. The subject line was blank. I opened the message cautiously. It contained a single, brief sentence. I saw your brother's post, and I cannot let him play the victim anymore. Attached to the email was a massive, compressed data file. I downloaded the folder and unzipped it. It was a chaotic treasure trove of internal corporate destruction. The sender was a former accounting clerk who had abruptly quit Crown Ember Hospitality 8 months ago. The digital folder contained high-resolution photographs of 2 completely separate payroll ledgers. One ledger was sanitized for the state tax authority. The second ledger was the reality. Mason had been aggressively altering the digital time clocks, manually shaving hours off his kitchen staff's shifts to forcefully bypass mandatory overtime laws. There were direct emails from Wade instructing the accounting department to systematically reclassify full-time line cooks as independent contractors to avoid paying health insurance premiums. While I was meticulously reviewing the horrific labor violations, a second message arrived through a secure professional networking platform. It was from a former pit manager I vaguely remembered from my days of free consulting. He did not bother with pleasantries. He just attached a series of digital screenshots. They were group text messages sent directly from Mason's personal cell phone to the kitchen management team. The messages were dated just 2 days before a massive county health inspection. Make sure you swap the red temperature binders before the county inspector gets here tomorrow. Mason's text read, hide the real logs in the trunk of my car. Put the dummy logs with the perfect numbers on the prep station clipboard. Do not mess this up, or you are all fired. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, staring at the glowing monitors. The scope of the war had instantly shifted. This was no longer just a targeted, isolated case of stealing my academic identity to bolster a single municipal stadium bid. This was a sprawling, systemic, deeply embedded culture of absolute fraud. They were stealing wages from the very community they claimed to feed. They were actively jeopardizing public health simply to maintain their ridiculous profit margins. They had scoffed at my strict adherence to the rules. They had mocked my doctoral research on organizational risk as useless textbook theory. They had demanded I look the other way for the sake of the family. I gathered the new files, secured them in a protected folder, and sent everything directly to Miriam Vance. They had ignored my final warning. The 72-hour window was over. I was done cleaning up their disasters. From that point on, I was building the case that would bring them down. I spent the next 48 hours securely tethered to my attorney. Miriam and I built an impenetrable, heavily fortified fortress of documentation. I did not just hand over the raw, unedited metadata. I provided a meticulous chronological map of my intellectual property. We cataloged the exact email timestamps, the original word processing drafts, and the cloud server version history stretching back over 5 years. I proved, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that the entire operational framework Crown Ember Hospitality was currently claiming as their proprietary genius was actually created by me, on my personal laptop, while I was sitting in a freezing university library long before Mason ever conceptualized his brand. The paper trail was absolutely flawless and completely undeniable. Furthermore, Miriam expertly packaged the anonymous whistleblower evidence, the high-resolution photographs of the manipulated digital time clocks, the deleted wage records, and the falsified health department temperature logs were seamlessly integrated into our central fraud dossier. The trap was no longer just set. Its heavy steel jaws were ratcheting open. Tooth by tooth, the blast radius of my family's arrogance began to expand rapidly, pushing far beyond the boundaries of a simple civil litigation dispute. The Mid-Lake Procurement Review Office, an incredibly strict, notoriously unforgiving independent municipal agency responsible for auditing large-scale public contracts, officially flagged the stadium concession bid. But their investigation did not stop there. Mason had spent the last 3 months loudly bragging on local radio stations and digital media platforms about securing a massive, exclusive vendor package for the new international airport terminal, framing it as the ultimate turning point of his entrepreneurial life. The Mid-Lake auditors immediately opened an aggressive, parallel review into that exact airport franchise paperwork. They were actively cross-referencing the falsified diversity scoring matrix, the forged safety certifications bearing my stolen signature, and the completely fictionalized payroll projections across multiple municipal jurisdictions. Mason's carefully constructed house of cards was suddenly sitting squarely in the middle of a Category 5 bureaucratic hurricane. The unmistakable, metallic scent of a major corporate scandal was finally leaking out of the sealed municipal offices and bleeding into the public domain. On a relentlessly rainy Wednesday afternoon, the main receptionist at Civic Meridian Risk Group transferred an external call directly to my secure desk line. It was not a prospective client. It was a senior business reporter from a major metropolitan newspaper located back in my hometown. He did not waste any time with polite introductions. He asked, point blank, if I could verbally confirm my active status as the Chief Culture and Safety Architect for Crown Ember Hospitality, and if I had any official comment regarding the rumors of an ongoing, highly sensitive municipal audit concerning their recent stadium bid. I gave him the only legally sound, utterly devastating answer possible. I stated clearly and unambiguously that I had never been employed by the company. I held absolutely zero equity or advisory roles, and I had absolutely no comment on their operational or administrative practices. The reporter thanked me profusely, his voice practically vibrating over the phone line with the thrilling adrenaline of a confirmed front-page scoop. The walls were rapidly closing in on Mason's empire. Then, the inevitable electronic invitation arrived. It successfully bypassed my heavily restricted blocked contacts list because Elena used a completely new generic event planning address created just for this occasion. The subject line read, "A time to heal and celebrate our journey." I opened the message and stared blankly at the glossy digital invitation. Elena was practically begging me to fly back to my hometown this coming weekend to attend a massive, open-air community barbecue hosted by Mason. Her lengthy message was completely drenched in manipulative, frantic desperation. She wrote extensively that the family desperately needed to present a strong, united front to the local community. She insisted that my physical presence would instantly crush the ugly, jealous rumors currently swirling around town, and that it was finally time to put our petty grievances aside and heal our family wounds. She swore there would be no arguing, just a beautiful, unified celebration of everything we had built together as one family. I immediately forwarded the email directly to Miriam. We both knew exactly what this event truly was, and it had absolutely nothing to do with healing. It was not a warm family reunion. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly desperate public relations stunt designed to save a sinking ship. Mason had rented out the absolute largest outdoor venue in the entire county. He had formally invited his primary angel investors, local business journalists, regional operational partners, and several key city council officials. He was clearly planning to stand on a brightly lit stage and publicly announce his imminent, multi-million-dollar expansion into the stadium and the airport as if the contracts were already locked in a vault. He desperately needed me there as a silent, compliant, and highly educated prop to legitimize his deeply fraudulent diversity claims. He needed to prove to the suddenly jittery investors that his brilliant sister, the newly minted doctoral risk management expert, was entirely on board with his grand, expanding vision. Miriam called me less than 5 minutes after reading the forwarded invitation. Her voice was incredibly sharp, fueled by strategic legal adrenaline. "Harper, this event is the absolute final nail in their coffin," Miriam said, her heels clicking loudly as she paced across her office floor. "If Mason stands up on a public stage, in front of active municipal officials and private financial investors, and actively uses your name, your academic credentials, or your supposed endorsement to solicit their money, he officially crosses the line from quiet, internal document forgery to active, highly public investor fraud. It legally cements the entire case as a coordinated, intentional, and malicious scam. But if you do not show up, he might sense the danger, play the victim again, and completely pivot his pitch away from your credentials. If you are physically present in that crowd, his sheer, unadulterated arrogance will absolutely compel him to use you as a human shield." I ended the call and sat in the quiet, climate-controlled hum of my Chicago office. A heavy, physically exhausting wave of dread washed over my entire body. The very thought of returning to that town, of smelling the thick hickory wood smoke and looking at the exact people who had spent my entire life grinding my self-worth into fine dust, made my stomach turn violently. Every single protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to stay away. Part of me just wanted to remain safely hidden in the Midwest, sipping my expensive green tea, and letting the cold, mechanical gears of the legal system slowly crush them from 1,000 miles away. I deeply wanted to choose peace. I wanted to leave the past completely behind me and focus entirely on my new, successful life where I was finally respected and valued. But as I looked at the towering, glass and steel skyline outside my wide window, a much colder, infinitely sharper realization firmly took hold of my mind. If I stayed away, if I remained the quiet, avoidant, and highly agreeable girl who hated messy confrontations, I would be handing them the exact lifeline they desperately needed to survive. My physical absence would provide an incredibly convenient, blank canvas for Mason to paint whatever elaborate lie he needed to survive the night. He would smoothly spin a tragic but inspiring story about my demanding corporate Chicago job keeping me away, while still aggressively leveraging my academic title in his glossy brochures to secure the investors' massive checks. I realized, with absolute crystal clarity, that my lifelong habit of suffering in silence and walking away from conflict was the very mechanism that had allowed them to operate without any consequences for so many years. I picked up my smartphone and hit the reply button on Elena's frantic email. I did not write a long paragraph. I did not ask for any conditions. I typed a single, incredibly brief sentence. I will be there. I was not booking a flight back home to save my family from the massive legal fire they had foolishly started. I was certainly not returning to cry on my mother's shoulder, or to desperately demand a long overdue apology for a lifetime of brutally unfair treatment. I was packing my suitcase for one specific, brutally practical reason. I needed to be standing exactly in the right place, looking directly into their panicked eyes, when the heavy gilded mask they had worn for over a decade was finally, violently ripped off their faces in front of the entire city. The trap was now fully set, the bait was placed, and I was going to be the only one holding the wire when the jaws snapped shut. The drive from the regional airport back to my hometown felt like moving backward through a thick, suffocating liquid. When I finally pulled my rental sedan into the massive, unpaved overflow parking lot behind the event grounds, I turned off the engine and just sat there for a long moment. Even through the sealed glass of the car windows, the heavy, unmistakable scent of slow-smoked hickory wood and caramelized sugar seeped into the cabin. It was immediately followed by the loud, rhythmic thud of a country music bass line vibrating through the gravel. For anyone else, it was the welcoming smell of a summer festival. For me, it was the exact scent of my stolen youth. That smell forcefully dragged me back through time. It tasted like the hundreds of nights I spent scrubbing sticky barbecue sauce off cheap vinyl tablecloths until my knuckles bled. It felt like the agonizing, mind-numbing hours I spent locked in a freezing walk-in refrigerator at 2 o'clock in the morning, taking mandatory inventory counts because Mason had gone home early to sleep. It sounded like the metallic screech of unfolding hundreds of folding chairs for massive, raucous backyard parties where I was explicitly treated like the hired help, completely excluded from the very family I was desperately working to support. Walking toward the main entrance was like walking through the empty halls of a childhood home that had been beautifully painted on the outside, while completely rotting away from the inside. Mason had spared absolutely no expense. He had transformed the dusty open field into a miniature corporate coronation. Bright, sweeping spotlights cut through the evening sky. Massive white canvas tents had been set up for the VIP section, guarded by hired security staff in black polo shirts. Everywhere I looked, there were gigantic, glossy banners flapping in the evening breeze, boldly declaring the Crown Ember Hospitality core values. The banners read, "Community, Quality, Trust." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of those 3 words made the bile rise in the back of my throat. Then, I saw it. Positioned near the entrance of the primary investor tent was a beautifully illuminated, towering informational board detailing the company's commitment to operational excellence. I walked closer, my eyes scanning the heavily polished corporate jargon. There, printed in small but distinct, elegant typography in the bottom right corner, was the final confirmation of their absolute arrogance. It read, "Internal safety and compliance systems built upon the rigorous academic foundation of Dr. Harper Rodriguez." They had received the formal, legally binding cease and desist letter from my attorney. They had read the explicit threat of federal litigation, and they had chosen to completely ignore it. They genuinely believed the rules of the universe simply did not apply to them. I stepped away from the sign and began to navigate through the dense, loud crowd of local residents and municipal officials. I saw dozens of familiar faces, the older kitchen staff members, the ones who had watched me quietly build the entire administrative backbone of this company for years, reacted to my presence with immediate, palpable guilt. The moment they made eye contact with me, they physically turned their bodies away, suddenly finding the dirt beneath their boots incredibly fascinating. They knew exactly what was happening behind the curtain, and they were deeply ashamed of their own complicity. But the younger staff members, the ones hired during Mason's recent, aggressive expansion phase, looked at me differently. They stared at me with wide, anxious eyes. They looked like terrified passengers trapped on a sinking ship, silently staring at the only person holding a life raft. Desperately waiting for a rescue, they were too afraid to ask for themselves. Before I could reach the edge of the VIP pavilion, a firm hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned around to face my mother. Elena was wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive silk dress that was undoubtedly purchased with the fraudulent profits of my stolen labor. She did not pull me into a warm embrace. She did not ask about my flight or how my new life in Chicago was going. Instead, she reached out with both hands and forcefully adjusted the collar of my blazer, smoothing the fabric with sharp, aggressive tugs. She was treating me exactly like a porcelain doll being carefully positioned in a storefront display window. "You look tense, Harper," Elena whispered, leaning in close so the surrounding guests could not hear her. Her voice was completely devoid of maternal warmth. It was the cold, clinical instruction of a stage director. "Just relax. All you need to do today is smile. Stand where we tell you, and let Mason handle the talking. Do not make a scene. Do not embarrass me in front of the city council members." I looked directly into her eyes. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply offered her a flat, completely empty smile, stepped backward out of her grasp, and walked silently past her into the investor tent. The air conditioning inside the pavilion was freezing. The space was filled with long tables draped in black linen, heavily loaded with expensive champagne flutes and towering stacks of glossy, leather-bound presentation portfolios. These were the exact documents Mason was about to hand over to the venture capitalists and the Mid-Lake procurement auditors. I picked one up from the edge of the table. I flipped past the visionary mission statements and the beautiful photographs of smoked brisket. I went straight to the legal appendices. There it was, page after page of forged documents. They were still actively using the digitally fabricated signature bearing my name on the hazard mitigation certificates. Furthermore, they had included a series of beautifully designed, incredibly complex human resources flowcharts. The charts depicted a perfectly balanced, fully compliant, and highly compensated workforce. It was a mathematical impossibility. I was holding a beautifully bound, perfectly printed volume of active corporate fraud. I dropped the portfolio back onto the table and stepped out the back exit of the tent, moving toward the dimly lit area where the catering vans were parked. I needed a moment of silence to steady my racing heart. As I stood in the shadows, a young kitchen worker, no older than 22, rushed around the corner of a refrigerated truck. He was wearing a grease-stained apron, and his hands were shaking violently. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. He looked over his shoulder, terrified that Wade or Mason might be watching. He closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps and practically collided with me. He reached out and forcefully pressed a small, cold piece of hard plastic directly into the palm of my hand. My fingers closed over a standard USB flash drive. "I know who you are," the young man whispered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I know you are the one who actually understands the laws. I cannot do this anymore. I do not want to go to federal prison for the things they forced me to sign. Please." He did not wait for me to respond. He turned and sprinted back into the smoke and the chaos of the prep kitchen. I stood in the dark for exactly 10 seconds, my fist tightly clenched around the plastic drive. Then, I moved. I walked swiftly and purposefully all the way back to the dark edges of the overflow parking lot. I climbed into the driver's seat of my rental car, locked all 4 doors, and pulled my laptop from my leather travel bag. I booted up the machine and inserted the drive. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of the car. The drive contained a single, massive digital folder. I clicked it open, and the entire rotting foundation of Crown Ember Hospitality was laid completely bare before my eyes. It was a meticulously archived chain of internal text messages and encrypted emails. There were direct, written orders from Wade instructing the shift managers to permanently delete the original time clock schedules from the main server to hide thousands of hours of unpaid overtime. There were group chat screenshots from Mason, sent just 3 days ago, aggressively demanding that the prep cooks entirely rewrite the meat temperature inspection logs before the Mid-Lake auditors arrived. There were highly detailed instructions on how to fraudulently alter the job descriptions of hourly dishwashers, reclassifying them as salaried managers to bypass strict municipal labor requirements. It was the smoking gun. It was the definitive, undeniable proof that the fraud was not just a one-time mistake made by an overzealous brother. It was a coordinated, deeply systemic criminal conspiracy directed from the absolute top of the organization. I did not hesitate. I opened my highly secure, encrypted email client. I attached the entire contents of the flash drive into a new message. I added the email address of Miriam Vance, my attorney in Chicago. I then added the direct, official email address of the lead investigator at the Mid-Lake Procurement Review Office. I typed a single line of text confirming the origin of the attached files, and I hit send. The progress bar rushed across the screen, hitting 100%. The files were gone, The heavy, invisible chain that had bound me to this family for 3 decades finally, completely snapped. I closed the laptop and stepped back out into the humid evening air. I walked slowly back toward the center of the festival grounds. The timing could not have been more perfectly cinematic. As I reached the edge of the massive crowd gathered in front of the primary stage, the overhead spotlights flared to full intensity. The heavy bass of the music faded out, replaced by the sharp feedback of a live microphone. Mason was striding up the wooden steps to the center of the stage. The crowd immediately erupted into thunderous, adoring applause. He grabbed the microphone from the metal stand with practiced, effortless charisma. His tailored shirt was perfectly pressed, and his smile was blindingly bright under the stage lights. He looked out over the sea of investors, politicians, and local fans with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who firmly believed that absolute victory was already sitting safely in his pocket. He had built his entire stage out of lies, and he had absolutely no idea that I had just quietly removed the final, critical support beam from right beneath his feet. The crowd fell completely silent as Mason gripped the microphone. He knew exactly how to play a room, having honed his craft not in business schools, but by manipulating our mother and dodging accountability for 31 years. He started with a low, humble tone, weaving a deeply emotional, heavily fabricated narrative about our humble beginnings. He spoke of a working-class family scraping by, turning a rusted backyard smoker into a beacon of community hope when we barely had a dime to our names. He painted a picture of late nights, calloused hands, and a relentless dedication to bringing people together over a shared meal. He claimed that over the last 48 months, he had personally worked 100-hour weeks to ensure every single employee was treated like family. He spoke about the upcoming municipal contracts not as massive financial windfalls worth millions of dollars, but as a sacred opportunity to feed the hardworking citizens of our great city. It was a flawless performance. If I did not know the exact numerical extent of his wage theft, or the precise contents of the digital flash drive I had just emailed to the municipal investigators, I might have actually believed him myself. Then, he turned his blinding smile toward the edge of the very important persons section where I was standing. The area was cordoned off with velvet ropes, filled with men in expensive suits eating plates of perfectly glazed ribs. Mason extended his right arm, palm open, inviting the primary stage spotlight to swing directly onto my face. The sudden heat of the lamp was blinding. But a vision this large cannot rest on just one set of shoulders, Mason declared, his voice booming through the towering, high-fidelity speakers flanking the stage. As we prepare to scale Crown Ember hospitality into the city stadiums and the international terminals, we knew we needed absolute structural perfection. We needed the smartest person in the room to build a flawless system from the ground up. And I am incredibly blessed that the smartest person I know happens to be my own sister. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the brilliant academic brain behind our entire culture and safety system, Dr. Harper Rodriguez. The applause was immediate and deafening. The venture capitalists sitting in the front row nodded in deep, approving unison, thoroughly impressed by the seamless integration of a highly credentialed, minority female executive into this rugged blue-collar brand. It checked every single box on their corporate diversity requirements. I looked past Mason and saw Elena standing near the soundboard. She was practically glowing under the ambient lights. Her perfect, highly curated family portrait was finally complete. She had her charismatic golden boy standing center stage claiming the glory, and her quietly efficient, highly educated daughter standing submissively in the background, serving as the perfect, validating ornament for his unbridled, fraudulent ambition. Mason gestured for me to step up the wooden stairs. I walked slowly, my face an absolute mask of stone. My heels clicked softly against the wooden floorboards of the stage. I stood next to him in the blinding heat, looking out over a sea of faces that had no idea they were cheering for a carefully constructed mirage. A man in a sharp, expensive gray suit stood up from the investor table. He held a secondary wireless microphone provided specifically for audience questions. He was a major player from a regional private equity firm, a man whose signature could authorize a check for $10 million in a heartbeat. Dr. Rodriguez, the investor said, his tone dripping with professional admiration. Transitioning from pure academic theory into high-volume municipal hospitality is a massive leap. It requires a completely different kind of operational endurance. How does it feel to be the foundational architect of your family's incredible American success story? Mason subtly nudged my elbow, a silent, aggressive command to play my designated role. He held his wireless microphone out toward my mouth, his smile never wavering, absolutely certain that my lifelong habit of public compliance would force me to cover for him one more time. I did not look at Mason. I did not look at my mother, who was holding her breath near the speakers. I looked directly into the eyes of the wealthy investor who was just hours away from wiring millions of dollars into a completely fraudulent enterprise. I leaned forward, bringing my lips close to the metal mesh of the microphone. "I am always proud of the truth," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any celebratory warmth or sisterly affection. The sentence hung in the heavy evening air for a long, agonizing second. Several people in the back of the crowd chuckled awkwardly, assuming it was a dry, academic joke that went over their heads. But the sharp, ruthless people in the very important persons section, the men and women who evaluated risk for a living, stopped smiling instantly. The investor in the gray suit lowered his microphone, his brow furrowing in sudden, sharp confusion. He recognized the distinct lack of corporate synergy in my answer. The energy in the pavilion abruptly shifted from celebratory to deeply, uncomfortably tense. Mason's smile froze violently on his face. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He quickly pulled the microphone back to his own mouth, letting out a loud, forced laugh to cover the sudden, chilling drop in the room's temperature. "Spoken like a true academic, folks," Mason shouted, desperately trying to wrestle the narrative back under his absolute control. "Always precise, always keeping us perfectly honest. Let us hear it for her one more time." The applause was significantly thinner this time, laced with a murmur of confused whispers. Before the clapping could fully die down, Mason clamped his hand around my upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging painfully through the fabric of my blazer. "We are going to take a quick 5-minute break before we present the final expansion numbers," Mason announced to the crowd, his voice tight. He did not wait for a response. He practically dragged me toward the heavy black curtains separating the main stage from the backstage prep area. The moment the heavy fabric fell shut behind us, blocking us from the view of the investors and the municipal officials, the charismatic community leader vanished completely. Mason shoved me into a dark, secluded corner next to a stack of empty audio equipment cases. His face was flushed red with a terrifying, barely contained rage. The smell of cheap cologne and stale sweat rolled off him. "What is your actual problem?" Mason hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You are deliberately trying to tank this entire night. I asked you to do one simple thing. Just stand there and smile for the cameras." "I am not a prop for your financial crimes," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, refusing to back away from his physical intimidation. Mason let out a frustrated, guttural sigh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked around the dark backstage area, ensuring none of the catering staff were listening, before stepping even closer to me. The anger on his face rapidly shifted into a cold, transactional calculation. "Fine," Mason said, his tone suddenly dropping into a flat, businesslike negotiation. "You want to play hardball? We can play hardball. I know you sent those legal threats to the restaurant. I know you are trying to squeeze me for a piece of the pie because you feel left out. So let us just cut the emotional garbage and make a concrete deal right now." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded, heavily stapled legal document. He thrust it toward my chest. "Sign the retroactive consulting agreement tonight," Mason demanded, tapping the thick paper with his index finger. "If you sign it right now and walk back out there to validate my bid to those men, I will give you a 5% equity stake in the entire regional expansion." I will wire $50,000 directly into your personal checking account the moment the city releases the first funding tranche. And I will legally transfer the deed of the house Mom is living in entirely into your name. It will be completely yours. No mortgages, no strings attached. You walk away wealthy. Mom stays safe in her home. And I get my public contracts. Everybody wins. I stared at him in the dim, dusty light of the backstage area. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of his moral bankruptcy was finally, entirely exposed. This was the defining moment. This was the exact second I realized Mason had never truly known a single thing about the woman I was. In his deeply corrupted mind, human integrity did not exist. Principles were just annoying negotiation tactics used to drive up a price. To him, absolutely everyone in the world could be bought. It was merely a matter of finding their specific price tag. He thought throwing money and a house at me would magically erase decades of emotional neglect, academic theft, and severe labor fraud. He genuinely believed my silence, and my complicity in his crimes, was up for sale. I did not look at the document. I did not raise my hands to take the pen he was offering. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I looked at the man who shared my blood and felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. He had built his entire identity on the adoration of a crowd, completely blind to the fact that his foundation was entirely composed of sand and stolen labor. "Keep your money," I said quietly. I turned my back on him. I did not wait to hear his response, his threats, or his counteroffers. I pushed through the heavy black curtains and walked back out into the cool evening air, entirely ignoring the stage and the confused murmurs of the crowd waiting for the presentation to resume. I walked steadily toward the perimeter of the festival grounds, my eyes scanning the horizon beyond the overflow parking lot. The deep blue of the twilight sky was suddenly broken by the rhythmic, flashing reflection of red and blue lights bouncing off the distant tree line. I watched in absolute silence as 5 dark, unmarked SUVs quietly turned off the main highway. They did not use their sirens. They moved with a slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly official precision, rolling silently over the gravel, their headlights cutting through the smoke of the barbecue pits, heading straight for the center of Mason's crumbling empire. Mason practically sprinted from the dark backstage area back into the blinding glare of the spotlights, desperately trying to wrestle the narrative back under his absolute control. He grabbed a fresh crystal flute of expensive champagne from a passing waiter and raised it high above his head. He flashed his signature, charismatic smile, ignoring the heavy tension that had settled over the front rows. He began loudly announcing the finalization of a massive, multi-million-dollar expansion agreement that would push Crown Ember hospitality across the entire Midwest region. He asked the municipal officials and the venture capitalists to raise their glasses to the future of the American dream. Before I could walk down the side stairs and leave the venue entirely, Elena materialized out of the shadows. She grabbed my left wrist with a terrifying, bruising grip. Her beautifully manicured fingernails dug sharply into my skin as she forcefully dragged me back into the center of the stage, positioning me shoulder to shoulder with Mason. She was fiercely determined to capture one final, perfect photograph of the united, highly successful family standing together before the press cameras. She hissed under her breath, ordering me to smile and act grateful. I did not smile. I did not shrink back into the shadows. I reached out and took the secondary wireless microphone resting on the wooden podium. Mason shot me a quick, triumphant glance, genuinely believing my lifelong habit of public submission had finally kicked in, assuming I was about to validate his fraudulent empire to save the family face. I brought the microphone directly to my lips. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, the flashing cameras of the local press, and the stunned faces of the kitchen staff. "My name is Dr. Harper Rodriguez," I said, my voice cutting through the humid evening air with absolute, chilling clarity. "I am stepping up to this microphone tonight to make a formal, legally binding public clarification. I do not work for Crown Ember Hospitality. I have never been employed by this company. I hold zero equity, and I have never served as their chief culture and safety architect. I have never signed a single operational certificate or safety guarantee for this brand. Furthermore, I have never granted my mother, my stepfather, or my half-brother permission to use my name, my academic degree, my professional identity, or my proprietary university research in any of their commercial bids or public relations materials. I paused for exactly 1 second, letting the weight of my words settle over the crowd. Every single document bearing my digital signature in the investment portfolios you are currently holding is a complete, malicious, and intentional forgery. The entire outdoor event space went completely, terrifyingly silent. The loud, rhythmic country music had already been cut by the sound engineer. The only sound left was the soft fluttering of the canvas tents in the wind. Then, absolute chaos erupted. The local business reporters immediately pivoted their heavy camera lenses away from Mason and aimed them directly at my face. The wealthy venture capitalists in the front row abruptly set their champagne flutes down on the tables and frantically flipped open their glossy leather binders, their eyes scanning the forged safety certificates with sudden, deep horror. Mason stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the champagne glass trembling violently in his hand. His charismatic mask had completely shattered, revealing the panicked, desperate fraud underneath. The heavy, rhythmic sound of boots marching up the wooden stage stairs broke the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The unmarked sport utility vehicles had unloaded. 2 federal agents, accompanied by the lead investigator from the Mid-Lake Procurement Review Office and Civic Meridian's internal legal counsel, stepped directly into the stage lights. The lead municipal agent did not carry a champagne glass. He carried a thick, heavily stamped stack of legal folders. "Mason Whitaker," the lead investigator announced, his voice projecting without the need for a microphone. "You are hereby served with an immediate, binding order to halt all business operations. We are executing a mandatory preservation of evidence mandate. All pending municipal stadium and airport contracts are officially frozen as of this exact minute. You are formally under investigation for coordinated bid rigging, wire fraud, academic impersonation, and severe, systemic labor violations." At that exact moment, notification chimes started going off from nearly every phone in the VIP pavilion. The local business reporter I had spoken to earlier that afternoon had just published his front-page exposé online. Guests began reading the headline out loud to one another. The article meticulously detailed the forged signatures, the business proposals heavily plagiarized from stolen academic materials, the entirely fabricated corporate diversity declarations, the manually altered kitchen payroll ledgers, and the internal text messages ordering the destruction of health department records. The financial partners reacted with ruthless speed. The private equity investors did not ask Mason for an explanation. They stood up in complete unison, zipped their briefcases shut, and walked swiftly out of the tent, effectively pulling millions of dollars of funding right out of Mason's hands in a matter of seconds. Representatives from the local meat and equipment supply companies immediately began shouting from the back of the crowd, aggressively demanding upfront cash payments for the thousands of pounds of food currently sitting on the grills. The magnificent, self-made brand of the brilliant backyard chef was disintegrating into dust before the eyes of the entire city. I turned to look at my mother. Elena was standing near the edge of the stage, her expensive silk dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The color had completely drained from her face. Her eyes were wide, locked onto my face, and in that agonizing, silent moment, I watched a profound and devastating truth finally break through her decades of delusion. For 30 years, she had aggressively conditioned me to be the perfect background character. She had taught me to work silently, to be meticulously precise with administrative details, to make myself relentlessly useful to others, and to endure deep unfairness without ever raising my voice. She had inadvertently forged me into the exact weapon capable of quietly documenting their crimes, waiting patiently in the shadows, and ultimately destroying their entire universe of lies with an airtight vault of undeniable evidence. I walked down the opposite side of the stage, I did not look back. The aftermath was brutal and entirely public. Following the federal indictments and the massive civil lawsuits filed by the defrauded municipal boards, I was awarded substantial legal settlements and corporate restitution for the egregious theft of my intellectual property. However, instead of purchasing a luxury sports car or a massive penthouse apartment, I channeled the financial compensation into something permanent. I established the Rodriguez Fellowship, a fully funded academic trust designed exclusively for first-generation university students pursuing degrees in corporate ethics and risk management. I also seeded a robust, dedicated legal defense fund specifically tailored for hourly service industry workers who were coerced or threatened into signing fraudulent compliance documents by abusive employers. 6 months after the collapse of Crown Ember Hospitality, a heavy envelope arrived at my corporate office in Chicago. It contained a long handwritten letter from Elena, stripped of her golden boy's wealth and her carefully curated social status. She finally offered a genuine confession. She wrote that the day she chose to abandon my doctoral graduation to attend Mason's barbecue was not merely a poor scheduling choice. It was the defining moment she explicitly showed her daughter her true, disposable position in the family hierarchy, right before attempting to harvest my academic light to illuminate Mason's dark, hollow ambition. I read the letter once. I did not book a flight back to my hometown to rescue them from the crushing debt and legal fees they had brought upon themselves. There was no tearful, cinematic embrace, and absolutely no fairy tale reconciliation. I mailed a single, incredibly brief reply, firmly maintaining the impenetrable boundaries I had built. I packed the letter away and stepped forward into my bright, successful future using the only name I ever truly owned, Harper Rodriguez. Behind me, the glittering barbecue empire that had treated me like a worthless, invisible backdrop had completely collapsed into ruin, simply because the person they underestimated the most was the only one who knew exactly where all the fraudulent support beams had been hidden. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.